The disability rights movement gained momentum as a result of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in America. It began to challenge negative attitudes and rebelled against discrimination, marginalization, and oppression. Protests escalated throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s. Some of the high-profile demonstrations were the 504 sit-ins in 1977. Activists entered the Federal Department of Health, Education and Welfare and refused to leave until Section 504 was signed. The Rehabilitation Act prevented discrimination against people with disabilities. Capitol Crawl followed in 1990, where the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act was stalled. Hundreds of demonstrators abandoned their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of the West Capitol entrance. It was eventually signed by George W. Bush on July 26, 1990. This law prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in several areas, such as employment, communication, accommodation, and transport. There were many other acts of defiance throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s that kept disability at the forefront, culminated in the largest international convention of disability rights. In 2006, called the UN CRPD, its motto is "Nothing about us without us." The main points of the UN CRPD are as follows. It was adopted on the 18th of December 2006, 13th of December 2006, and Ireland signed up to it in 2007. It's the first legally binding instrument with comprehensive protection for the rights of people with disabilities. It followed decades of work within the UN to change attitudes towards people with disabilities. As of July 2020, 181 states have ratified the convention. It's changed the viewing of people with disabilities as objects of charity and treatment to persons with disabilities who, as subjects with rights, who are capable of claiming those rights and making autonomous decisions around their lives. People with disabilities must enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedom. The UN CRPD sets a standard that people with disabilities are entitled by law to all the human rights that people without disabilities have. It has not created any new human rights. It states that all existing human rights must apply equally to people with disabilities. Prior to the UN CRPD, people with disabilities were denied their human rights and kept on the margins of society throughout the world. States must commit to changing their laws, policies and culture to comply with the UN CRPD. The Convention requires monitoring at both national and international levels. The UN CRPD was only ratified in Ireland in March 2018, and we were the last European country to do so. It is a very detailed treaty but some of the rights are the right to live independently, the right to inclusive education, the right to employment, the right to make autonomous decisions, the right to access and the right to healthcare, the right to respect for home and family, the right to respect for privacy, the right to freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse. The general principles of the UNCRPD are respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy including freedom to make one's own decisions without carers or other parties, non-discrimination. All states have an obligation to raise awareness and eradicate damaging stereotypes and prejudices in society. Full and effective participation and inclusion in society. Respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities. Part of human diversity and humanity. Equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, respect for the evolving capacity of children with disabilities and to preserve their identities. General comments on equality and non-discrimination. The Declaration on the Rights of Mentally Retarded Persons, 1971, and the Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons, 1975, were the first acts related to disability with a human rights perspective at their core. The human rights model recognizes that disability is a social construct and should not be used to deny rights. It acknowledges that disability is one of several forms of identity. It recognizes that human rights are interrelated, interdependent and indivisible. Recognition that all persons with disabilities are equal under the law means that, quote, there should be no laws that allow for the specific denial or limitation of the rights of persons with disabilities. Disability should be mainstreamed in all legislation and policies. End quote. And that's from the CRPD General Comment number 6, 2018. Critique. One of the main critiques of the UNCRPD is around mental health. There is a view amongst mental health practitioners that the treaty is too radical. Its position and has led to negative consequences for people with mental health difficulties. This is because it advocates for no involuntary detention. In the article Disabling Convention, the author poses a question that if the aspirations of the UNCRPD are too far removed from the reality of practice, does it weaken its position as an instrument for reform? It could be argued that the monitoring and enforcement of the treaty has not been very effective, as many of the barriers around access and employment are as prevalent today as they were in 2006.